Hi, Mark Granis here with Lecture 10.5, Inductive Reasoning about Causation. This is the last installment of material on inductive reasoning, and so let's get started. As usual, we'll begin with a recap, and in this case, we're recapping what we've learned about other kinds of inductive reasoning, generalizations and analogies. We're going to do that not because we're continuing with those topics, but precisely because we're not. We're moving on, and we can learn something about where we're headed by contrasting it with where we've been. Then we're going to talk about three different kinds of causation: necessary, sufficient, and contributing causation. This is something that educated people just know, and so you should know it too. And then we'll talk about John Stuart Mill's methods of induction. 5 different methods: agreement, difference, joint agreement and difference, residues, and concomitant variation. We'll end with a brief look at the unifying concept of relevance, which is the concept that we'll need a lot of as we move forward in Chapter 11 to look at informal fallacies. So previously in this chapter, we've been looking at generalizations and analogies, and in both those cases, we use them to generate new knowledge about the world from looking at particulars. In the case of generalizations, we're looking at the particulars in order to formulate new universal statements about the universals that the particulars are part of. So if I want to know more about metal in general, I can look at lots of individual metals. And if all the metals I know happen to conduct electricity, maybe all metals conduct electricity. Maybe that's something in the nature of metal. Or with analogies, on the other hand, we're still looking at a bunch of particulars, but in this case, we're looking at familiar particulars as a clue to unfamiliar particulars. We want to understand something new. We try to understand it in terms of what we already know about things that seem similar that with which we're already familiar. Now, inductive reasoning is never certain. It's only more or less probable. And for that reason, inductive reasoning is never valid or invalid. We don't talk about it that way. We talk about it as either stronger or weaker. That much will continue when we go into reasoning about causation. All inductive reasoning is governed by the principle of induction. That's how we tell whether it's stronger or weaker. We pay attention in particular to whether the inferiors are sufficiently numerous and whether the inferiors are sufficiently representative of what the new thing is that we're trying to know about, whether that be a universal or another particular. And we also need to make sure that we are never ignoring contrary evidence, that we're never ignoring a disconfirming instance, a disconfirming particular that would tell us that we're wrong about our hypothesis. All right, so now let's move on and let's take a look at 3 different types of causation: necessary, sufficient, and contributing causes. So generalizations and analogies often tell us how the world is. They help us understand it. What is the fact of the matter? How is the world put together? But causation tells us maybe why the world is that way or why something happens. And so this is a very specialized use of causation compared to something that we learned about earlier. I believe it was in Chapter 3 that we talked about Aristotle's 4 causes. And we talked about the 4 causes, and I think I mentioned at that point that Aristotle's using the word cause in a way that is different than the way most moderns use the word cause. With the 4 causes, you could just almost be talking about the 4 reasons why something is the way it is, or the 4 explanations of how something is the way it is. There's only one of Aristotle's causes, namely that of efficient cause, that which brings something about or sustains it in being. That's really the way that most modern people use the word cause, at least in English, from, 1800 on, 1750 on, something like that. And so when we talk about causation in this lecture, we're going to be using cause in that modern sense, in keeping with a lot of the logical work that we'll be discussing later with John Stuart Mill. So there are 3 kinds of cause in this modern sense that you should be aware of. One is necessary cause, one is sufficient cause, and one is contributing cause. We say that C is a necessary cause of E, that is, a cause is a necessary cause of an effect, if C must be present for E to occur. A cause is a necessary cause of an effect if C must be present for E to occur. So, for example, we say oxygen is a necessary cause of combustion, because oxygen must be present for combustion to occur. If there's no oxygen, there's no combustion. But oxygen is not a sufficient cause of combustion. We don't have combustion every time that oxygen is present. Oxygen is frequently present without combustion. In fact, I don't want to alarm you, but there's oxygen in the room where you are right now, and yet you're not in flames. That's because oxygen, though it's a necessary cause of combustion, it's a very strong causal relationship. It's simply not a causal relationship that makes oxygen dangerous under most circumstances. Absolutely essential for combustion, but not sufficient. A sufficient cause, on the other hand, we say C is a sufficient cause of E if C must be absent for E not to occur. Or if you wanted to say it a different way, you could say that C is a sufficient cause of E if E automatically occurs whenever C is present. But I've tried to present these in a way that you can see, present them as parallel as possible so that you can see what's different about the necessary and the sufficient cause. This may remind you of what we talked about the difference between a property and an accident in the 5 predicables. What's the difference? A property follows necessarily or exclusively from something that is essential. Okay, that's the same type of thing going on here with necessary and sufficient causation. There's an example of a sufficient cause. 100 grams of strychnine, which is a poison, happens to be sufficient to cause death in an average adult male. But it's not necessary. It's not a necessary cause. There are a lot of other things that can cause death in an adult male. Lots of ways to buy the farm that have nothing to do with strychnine. But if you have 100 grams of strychnine, nobody lives through that. So, can something be both? Sure, it can. For example, lightning is a necessary and sufficient cause of thunder, right? You can't have lightning without thunder, and you can't have thunder without lightning. So something can be both. But also something can be neither. And it's the neither cases that are more common and which also give rise to this interesting third type of causation. We say that C is a contributing cause of E, that is, a cause is a contributing cause of an effect, if the presence of C makes it more likely for E to occur, but C is neither a necessary nor a sufficient cause of E. So, for example, snow is a contributing cause of car accidents. You don't have a car accident necessarily just because there's snow on the road, and you can have a car accident even if there is not snow on the road, right? So snow's not a sufficient cause of a car accident, and neither is snow a necessary cause of a car accident. But accidents do go up when there's snow on the road. So snow is a contributing cause of car accidents. It's the same thing with smoking cigarettes. You don't necessarily get lung cancer from smoking cigarettes, so therefore cigarette smoking is not a sufficient cause. And it's possible to get lung cancer even if you're not a cigarette smoker. So cigarette smoking is not a necessary cause either. But clearly, cigarette smoking, your risk of lung cancer goes up considerably if you are a cigarette smoker. So it is a contributing cause of cigarette smoking. Now, in all of these cases, we notice varying degrees of correlation between C and E. That's what makes us suspect a causal relationship in the first place. And yet we know that causation is not correlation, right? Correlation is not causation. We know that however strongly you feel about it, the fact that your team won the last 3 home games is not because you wore your lucky socks, right? We just know that that's not the right answer. But if we rely on correlation in order to point us toward what the causes are, and yet we don't believe in the correlation, what do we do? Well, we have to have a way of sorting out the spurious incidences of correlation from the ones that could actually mean something. And John Stuart Mill gave us 5 methods of induction that are still taught widely today. They're not the end of wisdom on this matter. They're not the final word, but they are at least the beginning of wisdom on this matter. And they're worth taking a look at, even as we acknowledge their limitations. A word about John Stuart Mill. He was born 1806, died 1873. Very unusual person, child prodigy. He was raised to be a child prodigy. His father, James Mill, was, I believe, the personal secretary to Jeremy Bentham, who was a late 18th century, early 19th century philosopher. Jeremy Bentham is often best known as the father of utilitarianism, which is sort of a train wreck as a moral theory. Also a legal positivist, but maybe is better known for having had himself stuffed at the University College of London, where they used to wheel him out in a chair for board meetings. I mean, he must have been dead by 1840 or so. I don't know. Recently, I've heard that maybe they have him under glass. I don't know. Next time in London, maybe I'll have to schedule a trip at the University College of London to see Jeremy Bentham stuffed. Anyway, James Mill thought it would be a great idea for his son to spend a lot of time around Jeremy Bentham. And so you have this brilliant guy, John Stuart Mill, educated from a youth, to think very sharply about all these things, but also hanging out with a guy who's a little bit weird. And you find both these streaks, I think, in the thought of John Stuart Mill. He was once called the most influential British philosopher of the 19th century, which is saying something. And yet, and some of the stuff that he writes is brilliant. Brilliant defense of free speech, probably the best defense of free speech in the English language, and yet also some stuff that is really quite strange. Well, the logic stuff makes it into the brilliant side of his work rather than the quite strange side of his work. And so these 5 methods are what he came up with early and what we still look at today when we're thinking about how to sort out causation from correlation. Mill's first method is the method of agreement. If all observations of E have C in common, then C and E are more or less probably causally related. In other words, if it's what agrees among all of the instances of the effect that we're looking for that jumps out at us. So, if all the patients who are sick with symptoms that look like they maybe have been exposed to E. coli, if they all eat the same lettuce, well, the lettuce is probably tainted. We look for what agrees among all of the cases, all the instances of the effect that we are observing. This is common sense, but it's also important to understand its limits. It's only conjectural. That is, we can start looking at the lettuce, and then maybe that story will hold up and we'll decide it's the lettuce. Maybe it won't. So this guides our investigation. In some cases, not maybe with the lettuce, but in some cases you might have to set up a lab experiment to isolate the effect and see whether that's really the only thing that agrees or whether there is something else. But this is the way that we try and make advances. We notice things and then we test them. Now note that I've used C and E as if cause and effect is very, very clear, but note that the direction of causality is not always clear. Sometimes it is, so it can't possibly be the case that thunder causes lightning. Why not? Well, the thunder comes second, right? There's no theory as to how thunder could possibly cause lightning. But in a lot of cases, for example, the incidence of homelessness and decreases in social spending or something like that, well, they're not quite as chronological as thunder and lightning. It's not at all easy to know in that case what might be causing what. All we can say is that if we find these things constantly together, there may be a causal connection. They may be causally related, and we ought to take a look at that. So what's this good for? Well, Mill's first method is really useful when we're trying to narrow down the list of things that could possibly be necessary causes. Because anything that doesn't agree among all the instances of E can't possibly be a necessary cause. In other words, if it were possible to have combustion without oxygen, then oxygen wouldn't be a necessary cause of combustion, right? So the agreement that we're looking for here is really useful for trying to narrow down our list of potentially necessary causes. If you don't find it in all the places, then you haven't got a necessary cause. So with the lettuce, if the sick people didn't all eat the lettuce, then the lettuce isn't the necessary cause. And then what do we do with that? Well, then we look further. Did they all eat at the same restaurant? Maybe the restaurant is the thing. Maybe there's a hand washing problem or another sanitation problem at the restaurant. Or maybe it's some other vegetable at the restaurant. Look for the commonality. The idea here is to look for some kind of agreement among all the cases and then see if that is causally related. All right, let's move on to Mill's second method. So Mill's second method is called the method of difference. If we have observations of E and not E, and those observations have everything in common except C, well, C in the case of E and not C in the case of not E, then C and E are more or less probably causally related. So, for example, if Mr. Smith got food poisoning and Mrs. Smith didn't, and they ate all the same meals, they ate at the same places for the last 3 days, except Mr. Smith ate the sushi. Maybe he stopped, maybe it was sushi at a place that he stopped without Mrs. Smith, and she would never have gone in there, but he ate the sushi. Anyway, the sushi then, if it's the one difference, then the sushi is probably causing the food poisoning. Again, this is only conjectural, you have to test it. And again, this works very much like just the flip side of Mill's first method. So whereas that one was useful for narrowing the list of potentially necessary causes, this one is useful for narrowing the list of potentially sufficient causes. Because anything that can be present, both in the case of E and in the case of not E, can't possibly be a sufficient cause of E, right? So in the Mill's first method, the agreement, the one thing that is in agreement across all the cases pops out at us. And in Mill's second method, the one thing that is different between cases where we see the effect and where we don't see the effect, that's what jumps out at us. And so that's the way the first two work. Now the third method, there's a lot of disagreement actually about whether this is really a separate method. Mill called it the method of joint agreement and difference. If observations of E all have only C in common, and observations of not E have only not C in common, then C and E are more or less probably causally related. So I'm with the people who say this is not really a separate method. It's just using two things at once, as indeed Mill's title sort of suggests. It's more of a lucky coincidence. But I think we're entitled to wonder just how often the universe serves up this kind of lineup of easy agreement and difference, where it's just so obvious that there's only one thing in common or that there's only one thing that's different. And this points to a common complaint about all of Mill's methods. Every observation of any phenomenon comes to us as embedded in a huge variety of circumstances. And it's not easy to know which of them to investigate. So, for example, we could say, well, all the people who had the E. coli sickness, they all ate the same lettuce. Yeah, but they all probably drove to the restaurant. Did the car have anything to do with it? In other words, there'll be a lot of things that those cases have in common. And it takes some kind of additional application of human intelligence to know that some of those things are worth looking at and some of those things are not worth looking at. This gives rise to what's sometimes called the scotch and soda fallacy. If I drink 3 glasses of scotch and soda tonight before bed, I may wake up with a headache. If then tomorrow night I drink 3 glasses of bourbon and soda before bed, I may wake up the following morning with a headache. And then the next day, maybe I'll try some rye whiskey and soda and 3 glasses of that before bed, and I wake up with a headache. And you get the idea. Sooner or later I say, what's the one thing that agrees among these 3 mornings that I woke up with a hangover? Well, it's obviously the soda, right? So this Mill's first method would suggest that I have to eliminate the soda. Well, so that's, that's very funny, yes. But that doesn't quite end the story, and I think Mill has a comeback there, which is that after we fall, if we fell for the scotch and soda fallacy, we would eventually eliminate the soda and see that the effect persists. And in that case, we would know that because of Mill's first method, we could eliminate actually the soda as a potential cause, and we would start to look for something else. And eventually we might find that something else is the alcohol. Maybe I missed it the first time because I called the alcohol by 3 different names based on the liquor that it was contained in. But it's really the same alcohol at bottom. It really turns out there really is one thing that agrees among all those cases. We were just missing it because we called it a different name. A related fallacy has to do with the finger snapping to keep elephants away. This was a joke that circulated when I was, I think about 6th grade. And the idea is there's a guy on the street and he's snapping his fingers. and someone walks up and says, "Why are you snapping your fingers?" And he says, "Well, I'm trying to keep elephants away." He says, "There's no elephants for thousands of miles." And the guy says, "See, it works." Just as you have to watch out for the Scotch and soda fallacy, you also have to watch out for hypotheses that can't be falsified, right? Where you never even see the evidence of the ridiculousness because you've reasoned to it in a circular way, where it seems like your evidence confirms what you've always thought, but really you have not accurately assessed the situation. All right, let's talk about the fourth method of induction from Mill. It's the method of residues. If we eliminate all known causes of E except for C, then the remaining level of E is more or less probably causally related to C. In other words, what we can't eliminate of E is probably related to what we can't eliminate of all the known causes of E. You think, wow, this doesn't seem very useful, but it's how you would measure a puppy at a veterinarian's office, right? You hold the puppy. You can't tell the puppy to be still. So you hold the puppy, you step on the scale, and then you put down the puppy, and you subtract your weight, and that'll be the weight of the puppy, right? This is also maybe how a grocery store might estimate losses due to theft. You can't simply ask the people who are shoplifting from the store to check in at the front desk so we can write down what you're stealing. It doesn't work that way. If you're going to detect the amount of theft, you can only do that by subtracting out all the other things that aren't theft, that are reasons why items fly off your shelves in ways other than sale, right? So you know what you bought, you know what you sold, you know what you threw away because it was spoiled, and you know what you threw away because somebody broke it, right? Clean up on aisle 9 or something like that. If you've kept track of all those things, then you can subtract all those things out and you can find out how much theft there was. This is also the way the planet Neptune is discovered. I wrote here that it's an astronomer. I think it might have been actually a mathematician who was not an astronomer. I don't think the astronomy part was very difficult once they worked out the math, that Neptune ought to be about where they found it based on all the other causes that they could compute from the known positions of other known planets. All right, what's the fifth method? Mill's fifth method of induction is the method of concomitant variation. Concomitant, such a great word. Things that go together. Things that necessarily go together. If we see varying degrees of E in the presence of varying degrees of C, then C and E are more or less probably causally related. This is how we know that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer, right? Because people who smoke more have a greater increase in their risk in lung cancer than people who smoke less, even though everyone gets an increase in lung cancer. This is also often how we assess the effects of changes in public policy. So, for example, does homelessness go up or down when we close mental hospitals, right? We can see in time that there's one level of social spending that we have, and then we reduce that level of social spending and we can observe what happens to what effect that has on homelessness. Or does crime go up or down when we ban handguns? This is an experiment run many times. We know there's a certain level of crime, and then in a given year, we will ban handguns and then maybe see over the next 4 or 5 years what happens to the crime rate. And it would be beyond the scope of this lecture for me to comment much on either of those, but they're interesting. Look them up. This takes us then to the unifying concept of relevance. We normally notice these potential causes by noticing correlation between events that occur together and often occur together, many times, often simultaneously or maybe just in quick succession. But we know that correlation is not causation. We're not dumb enough to fall for the idea that our team wins because we wore, our lucky sweatshirt, or that the stock market goes up because the Phillies won the World Series or something like that, right? So when these correlations suggest themselves to us, we have to investigate more. We have to investigate factors for which we have a theory of how they could be relevant, right? In other words, there needs to be some mechanism by which we can understand how this might cause it, and that guides our research and guides our experimentation. All right, that's it for a rather long session today. That's inductive reasoning about causation, and that's the end of Chapter 10. I will see you next time with Chapter 11 on informal fallacies.